or should we just get started?
Yeah, we are live now.
Sessions, I don't.
Got it. So, hey everyone, welcome to the Akash-a-thon workshop series. Today we have with us Carruthers, who will talk about deploying on the Akash server, setting up the Akash server, and help you get started with your projects more efficiently. Always very excited to kick off these workshops. One of my favorite ways to get out what the aim of the hackathon is. And hey, we also have Carruthers with us now. Welcome. Any opening thoughts that you would like to throw light on? Anything for the builders that you have that you want to say, and then we can kick off with the presentation.
Yeah, I guess just to open, today we considered going through a national provider build during this series, but that's kind of a lengthy process. And we've actually got feedback from the community recently that our documentation is pretty straightforward for the actual provider build. So we're not actually going to go through the build of the provider today, but we're going to go through the user journey, both from the provider perspective and from a tenant deployment perspective. So I have a connection to a provider that's live on mainnet. I'll go through several use cases and examples using that live provider, and also show where we can get support and documentation as people undertake building a provider themselves.
Perfect. So yeah, if during the course of the workshop, anyone watching has any doubts, any feedback, any questions for us, feel free to drop it in the comments, and we'll take that up towards the end. Towards the end, preferably Carruthers and Rodrigo. Hey, Rodrigo, welcome to the workshop. These guys can also, drop their Discord, Twitter, or any communication channel so that you can also take those questions up later. But feel free to put out as and when you have them. Let's get started, guys.
Okay, sounds great. So I'm just going to get started. Definitely would love this to be very interactive. So if anyone has any questions as I go along, please feel free to interject at any time. As we discussed in the very beginning, my intent and goal for today's session is to make people more familiar with Akash providers, and more specifically, GPU providers. So as most in the audience are probably aware, we recently went through a network upgrade to mainnet 6. And the biggest introduction in mainnet 6 was the introduction of GPU support. So this session will be highlighting GPU providers on the Akash network, and we'll go through both journeys from a provider perspective and also a deployer perspective. So we'll really get into the heart of how one will go about initiating a build of an Akash provider, how to do some troubleshooting, what SDLs or the YAML files that are recipe for a GPU deployment look like. So we'll get into all that, and again, definitely encourage any questions as I go along. So to launch right in, I don't want to make any assumptions on the audience's previous understanding or experience with an Akash provider. So I guess I want to start from a very foundational element and just ensure that when I say Akash provider, everyone in the audience is cognizant of what I'm referring to. So if we go to the Akash.network main page, and we look at the super cloud. So Akash has built a super cloud. And if you read into the description of a super cloud, this uses a reverse auction mechanism. And by reverse auction mechanism, what we mean is a deployer or a tenant on the Akash network launches a deployment. And in that deployment, they have a recipe for the hardware specs and the price that they're willing to spend on that deployment. Based on that order that is then placed onto the Akash network and onto the Akash blockchain, providers within the network, a provider in the Akash ecosystem is a self-sovereign entity. So it could be a data center, it could be someone with excess spare compute in their home lab or home network or other business entities. But all these self-sovereign providers on the Akash network will take the order that a tenant or a deployer issued, and then will bid on that workload. So this is the reverse auction mechanism. And again, to kind of boil that down, a provider on the Akash network is a provider of compute. So spare and excess compute that we now monetize and put onto the Akash network. So with that understanding of kind of the two primary roles within the Akash network, the tenant and the deployer and the provider, what I wanted to do and previously mentioned today is go through some deep dives into the build and mechanics behind hosting, becoming and maintaining a provider on the Akash network. And more specifically, again, with the mainnet 6 launch, we recently introduced GPU support. So more specifically, I'll be going through the mechanisms to build a GPU provider on the Akash network. So to begin, where I wanted to begin our conversation was, if you look at the page that I'm currently on, this is the Akash documentation site. So it's docs.akash.network. And if we go onto the documentation site and then drill into the providers section of the documentation, and we click on build a cloud provider, this is kind of our launch pad and where we would go as an initiation point to build a provider on the Akash network. So there's a couple of different guides here. First of all, our primary mechanism to build an Akash provider is through Helm charts. In the background, an Akash provider runs their own independent Kubernetes cluster. So some of the audience may be familiar with Kubernetes. We actually recommend that to become an Akash provider using our manual provider build process, that you have a decent amount of Linux and Kubernetes skills. And anyone that's become a provider can appreciate why we recommend that. There's a lot of troubleshooting steps, and a lot of the steps in the build process become much easier if you're a Linux administrator or have some Linux chops, and also have some Kubernetes experience. We do have other paths that make it a little more simplistic, so you don't have to have quite the level of Kubernetes experience, and I'll get into that path as well. But for our primary build process, we definitely recommend some pre-existing Kubernetes experience. As I mentioned earlier, there's several documents within the provider section of the documentation site. So as you can see, the primary build for an Akash provider, we also bring prominently into your attention optional steps within the provider build process, like troubleshooting and the verifications and troubleshooting as we go further down into the document, and also some optional steps that aren't necessary for a provider, but definitely can increase your activity and the amount of deployments that end up on your provider if you activate some of these additional features like persistent storage. So persistent storage being not just the deployment having referral storage, but persistent storage so that it can withstand a reboot of the Kubernetes pod that's hosting the deployment. So these kind of features and functionalities can definitely increase the amount of activity on your provider and the amount of leases from tenants that you're getting on your provider. Today, as I mentioned, fresh off the mainnet 6 launch, I want to focus on specifically building a GPU provider on the Akash network. As mentioned prior, we had some discussion on if the best use of our time this morning would actually go through a GPU provider build, but it's somewhat of a time-consuming process. It's really not overly complicated, but it can be time-consuming. So instead of going through a provider build today, we're going to take a look at a provider that's already live on the Akash network, a GPU provider that's already live on the Akash network. And then we'll go through some validations and give you a lot of insight into what troubleshooting and the topology and the mechanisms behind a GPU provider on the Akash network. So that's what we'll primarily get into. I do also, just on the general topic of providers, I mentioned prior that we recommend to become an Akash provider, you have a relatively high degree of knowledge of Linux and Kubernetes. I do want to bring to your attention, under the community solutions section of our documentation site, a partner in our ecosystem named Prater has a build process that is much more simplistic. And when I mentioned earlier, a path for those that maybe don't consider themselves Kubernetes experts, I definitely highly encourage you to become familiar with the Prater provider build process because it's a much more simplistic. It builds Kubernetes in the background, and the amount of skills that are necessary in the Kubernetes and Linux realms become a little bit less. So if you're building a small or medium provider, I would definitely encourage you to become familiar with the Praetor build process as well. Also, before I get started, before we actually launch into some granular details of building and maintaining a Akash provider, I also want to make sure that everyone in the audience is aware of support channels that you can go to if you start to go down the path of building your own Akash provider. So if I go over to, and this is all, if you go to our documentation site and go under technical support, you can very easily find our Discord server. And if you join the Akash Discord server, there's constant conversation between myself and other people of the core team and also Akash insiders. And you can go into channels like the provider channel. And this is really constantly evolving and constantly up-to-date conversations about people in the community that are building providers. And definitely a very ripe conversation today is GPU provider builds, again, because it was so recently introduced. So if you start to go down the path of building your own GPU provider on the Akash network and you run into any hiccups whatsoever, please join our Discord server and you'll get immediate support, again, both from myself and other members of the Akash core team. And also we have some very excellent, highly skilled insiders, Akash insiders, that can help you through any of your build challenges. So definitely encourage becoming familiar with our Akash Discord server as well. One other thing that I wanted to show before we actually start to launch in and look at Akash providers and do some role playing from a tenant and deployer perspective and looking at the provider as we go through these role playing exercises of launching deployments onto the Akash network and onto our own provider. I also wanted to make you aware of that partner in our ecosystem, again, Praetor, has a page that gives us some introspection of what the Akash network currently looks like. So when I mentioned earlier that the Akash network is made up of many self-sovereign providers, and these are providers that are running their own self-sovereign Kubernetes cluster and their own self-sovereign provider instance, you can see what the makeup of the network currently looks like. So currently on the network, we have 54 providers, and that's really been growing rapidly since the introduction of mainnet 6 and the excitement over the GPU support and availability. I think we've had quite a bit of jump over the last couple of weeks. So we can get some instantaneous inspection of the number of providers that are currently on the network. And then we can also get some finer granularity details of the current state of the Akash network. So most interestingly, because it's so new, if you look at GPUs on the network, what is that? We have 149 GPU instances on the network. 80 of those are currently active within a lease. So if you hear me say lease going forward, by lease, I mean, if as a tenant, as an Akash deployer, if I launch a workload onto the Akash network, I establish a lease with my selected Akash provider. So I'll get bids back from a number of providers that are able to host my workload. And then when I select a provider and actually bring that workload live, I create a lease with my selected provider. So when I say there's 80 GPUs currently under a lease, those are 80 GPUs that are active within a lease on specific providers. And again, we have 69 GPUs available for additional workloads, bringing the total to 149 GPUs total on the Akash network, and even more so than the provider counts. That's rapidly growing daily. I think over the last few days, we have typically like 10 or 20 new GPUs coming onto the network each day, which is obviously incredibly exciting. So what I wanted to do today, again, is I want to go through the journey of a GPU provider, and we're going to look at this journey both from a tenant perspective, someone making a deployment, and then we're also going to look at the role of the provider on the network. So we're going to look at the journey from a deployer tenant perspective, and we're also going to look at the journey from the provider perspective as well. I mentioned earlier that instead of actually going through the process of building an Akash provider during this session, I have a GPU provider on Akash mainnet currently, and I'm going to use that provider instance to give us some more insight into the topology and the mechanics behind an Akash provider. And hopefully this will be very illuminating from understanding that topology and also some troubleshooting and validation perspectives. I think using this live provider will be very illuminating. And again, when you go to the point of actually building your own GPU provider, I think we have very robust, excellent documentation that's been highly sanity checked by the community. And then we also always have that supported within our Discord server. So what we're currently looking at, as you can see, I have a number of different terminal sessions open right now. And I want to focus on my own Akash GPU provider. So again, because the provider is built with a Kubernetes cluster in the back end, we can get into the Kubernetes cluster and run a number of different verifications and kind of look at the topology and the components of a Akash provider. So again, for any of those familiar with Kubernetes, if I just go in and do a couple of simple displays, we can take a look at the topology. So currently the Akash GPU provider that we're looking at is made up of 3 nodes. One is one of those nodes is a control plane node, and then we have 2 worker nodes. This particular provider only has a single GPU resource available. It's a NVIDIA T4 GPU. And I can actually look at that. If I go over to another terminal session, I'm going to do a curl. The Akash provider has an API endpoint, a status API endpoint, and we can use that endpoint to look at the available resources and the total resources and the type of resources on that Akash provider. So to query that status API endpoint, I'm going to put in my URI. So it's my particular provider as that provider at Akash testing.xyz. Just put in the port number. And again, I'm using the status API endpoint of my own provider. And I'm just going to use JQ to give us some better statistics. What did I do wrong with that curl command here? One second. What is wrong with my curl command? Okay, I just had a typo that I'm not spotting. Let's see. Okay, I must have had a typo in the original command. But as you can see, what I'm doing here is the Akash provider has a status API endpoint. So at any point, I can get in and look at the status of my provider. So this test provider that we're going to look at, that I showed the bare bones topology of the Kubernetes cluster, I'm now doing a query of that provider's status endpoint to get an idea of how many workloads are currently active on that provider. And also I'm interested in deploying a GPU workload onto that provider. So I just want to make sure that it has available GPU resources. So again, on this very small Akash provider using the status endpoint, I can see that we have 1 available GPU endpoint. So we should be in good shape to host the workload that we're going to go through. And again, going through this journey of both the tenant and the provider. So that's the current status of the provider, the test provider that we're going to look at. The other thing from a Kubernetes perspective that I wanted to look at is I'm just going to show the pods that are running in my Kubernetes cluster, and specifically the pods that are running in a namespace called Akash services. So if I look at the pods that are currently running in that Akash services namespace in Kubernetes, I can see that I have an Akash provider. So if you go through the process of building a provider through our documentation, whether you use the Prater app in our ecosystem, or you go through the manual build process through our Helm charts, we'll launch the actual Akash provider as a pod running within the Kubernetes cluster. So we can see that here. If I look at the pods that are currently active within my provider Kubernetes cluster, one of those pods is the actual Akash provider pod itself. And we'll get into this a little bit more when we look at logs that are running within that provider as we launch a test workload. But as we can see, that Akash provider is active and running on my test Akash GPU provider. So now what I would like to do is, again, I want to go through the journey of launching a deployment from a tenant, a deployer perspective, and then I want to see that deployment hitting our Akash GPU provider. So before we do that, and again, just to make sure and level set so that everyone is kind of operating from the same knowledge base, what you're currently looking at on your screen is called an Akash SDL. SDL stands for Service Description Language, and it's our own type of YAML recipe for an Akash deployment. I won't get too heavily into the Akash SDL because this is definitely something that you can review on your own, but just to highlight a couple of points. When I launch this deployment, which we'll see in a couple of seconds, first of all, we can draw attention to the fact that this SDL, this recipe for my deployment, is using a image. So one important thing to understand, and this might seem somewhat self-evident, knowing that we're running these workloads on a Kubernetes cluster. Any Akash deployment, in order to launch a workload onto the Akash network, it needs to be containerized. So when I point to this image is for a simple vanilla bare bones Ubuntu 22.04 version. So basically what I'm doing in this SDL is I'm just launching a vanilla Ubuntu server. And then when that image launches within a container, within a Kubernetes pod on my provider, I'm going to launch a vanilla Linux OS. And then when that Linux OS loads, I'm then going to run some commands. And in this command, I'm just doing some simple arguments. So I'm going to check the uptime of the provider pod. And I'm also going to look at NVIDIA SMI information. So it's going to output some information about the GPU model and resource that I am launching this deployment onto. So a lot of this, like I said, I won't get too far into the weeds with the SDL. The other thing I would draw your attention to is the resource specs that we're going to use for this deployment. So as you can see, and pretty self-evident, we're going to use a single CPU for the deployment. We're going to use a gig of RAM. And then the most interesting thing about this specific deployment is the specification of the GPUs that I require for my deployment. So I'm saying in this SDL that I want a single GPU resource. And in this SDL, I'm specifying that the GPU model needs to be NVIDIA T4. Currently, we only support NVIDIA GPUs, but that's going to be rapidly evolving, and we'll support other GPUs like AMD and others in the near future. But currently, the only supported vendor is NVIDIA. And then this portion of the SDL is actually completely optional. If I wanted to, I could just eliminate this line. And if I was to launch this SDL, again, so this is as a tenant or someone that's interested in launching a deployment or a workload onto the Akash network, this is my recipe for the deployment. And if I, as the tenant, don't really care what kind of NVIDIA GPU that I'm getting, the model is completely optional. But if your workload say is very intensive, it could only run on like a H100 or a A100. Obviously, we're going to want to specify that I only want to get bids back from Akash providers that are able to facilitate a A100 or H100 reservation. In this circumstance, since I know that my test provider that we're looking at and experimenting with has a T4 GPU, I'm just going to include the T4 model in the SDL to make sure that I'm only getting bids back from my provider and possibly a couple of others. Before I move, I know that's a lot on the Akash SDL. So before I move on and actually show the mechanisms of creating a deployment and what that will look like when it hits our test Akash GPU provider, I also just want to go back to the Akash documentation site and draw your attention very prominently under the intro to Akash, that SDL, this SDL that that I'm using for this experiment. This has a stack definition language, SDL specification will guide you through all the different components of this SDL. And most importantly, with our recent introduction of GPU support, there's an excellent GPU section. So the things that I just covered of the model is optional. So you could just leave it with no model and only specify the vendor and then get bids back from any provider that has available NVIDIA GPUs. Or alternatively, you may have a workload that say might be appropriate to run on a A100 or a H100. So you can also, this is an array, so I can also specify multiple models. So if I have a workload that I need a certain type of GPU, but it could be amongst a couple of different models, you can definitely list multiple models as well. And we also have some excellent links here of some full examples of a SDL and so you can follow those links off the stack definition language within the Akash documentation. Before I go on, I know that I'm covering a lot here. Just take a pause. Are there any questions from the audience at this point, or should I just keep going? Okay, I'm going to take that as I'll just keep going for now.
All
okay.
good for now.
Okay. Also, from a support perspective, and Rodri, who's on the session with us today, can definitely attest to this. I'm a constant presence in that Akash Discord server. So as you're going through the mechanisms and the mechanics of building your own Akash provider, I'm one of the people that has a constant presence on that site. So as you start to get into these SDLs and the provider builds, not only the community at large, but I definitely live within that Discord server as well. So whether you have any questions during this call, or if you have any questions as you're viewing this recording afterwards, please feel free to reach out to me directly as well. So now kind of with that framework in place, and with some of that knowledge in place, I want to go through the mechanisms of, we have this Akash provider, we have this test Akash GPU provider that I personally maintain. This is just one of the 54 current providers on the Akash network. So now I want to go through the journey of, both from a tenant perspective, I'm going to use the SDL that I just covered to launch a deployment. And it's actually going to launch what we refer to as an order onto the Akash network. So you're going to see in the next step, I'm going to create a deployment. When I create that deployment, that's going to place an order on the Akash blockchain. When I place that order onto the Akash blockchain, I'm going to go through and show you some of the ways that we can verify that that order is being ingested by my own Akash provider. And we're going to go through some of the validations that my provider is responding to with a bid to that workload. So again, we're going to put an order based on the SDL, based on my requirements for the workload, the resource specs that I need, and also the price that I'm willing to pay for the deployment. I'm going to place that network onto the Akash network, and then we're going to see my provider be one of several. It's going to be a small number of providers that respond with a bid in this circumstance, because I specifically stated that I need a GPU of NVIDIA T4. So there's only a couple of providers on the network currently that have T4s. We have a lot more like H100s and A100s, but there's only a few providers that are able to facilitate a NVIDIA T4. So as I put that order onto the network and onto the Akash blockchain, we're going to see, both from a client perspective, get a bid back from my provider. And then we're also going to dive into the logs from my specific Akash provider, and we'll actually see within the provider logs the bid mechanism. So we're going to see the actual response in my provider logs as a response to that order being placed onto the network. So for that purpose, let's go back, and I'm going to copy this SDL. So again, this is just a very simplistic Ubuntu that's going to run NVIDIA SME information, so we can look at the GPU resources where this workload lands, to do a validation that it actually is a T4 GPU that is being provisioned for this workload. So I'm going to use this specific SDL. And now if I go into a browser, I'm going to use the Akash console as our mechanism to launch the deployment. So right now I'm playing the role of a deployer or a tenant on the Akash network. Again, going back to, I always want to reference documentation as much as possible, so that you guys can always go back and get this information yourself. But if I collapse some of these menus and look at our documentation site, and I go to deployments, you can see the different tools that we currently have for launching a deployment onto the Akash network. So we have our own, I work for Overlock, the parent company that created the Akash network. We've developed our own client called the Akash console, which we're going to use during our demonstration. We also have the extremely popular Cloud Most Deploy tool for launching deployments, which is another web app. And then for people that are more DevOps inclined, and this is honestly the way that I normally do deployments, I could also go into an Akash CLI. I have a Akash CLI loaded if Zoom screen will go away. I have this. So anything that I'm about to show, I'm just going to do a simple command from the Akash CLI. Anything that I'm about to do regarding launching a deployment, I could also do from the CLI as well. So the only thing I'm showing here is just the Akash CLI is loaded. So with that Akash CLI loaded, I can do a number of different commands from the CLI. So I could do something like the binary name is provider services, and then I could do something like create a transaction. And as you can see, if I do provider services TX for a provider services transaction, one of the subcommands is a deployment. So the deployment creation steps that I'm about to go through in a GUI interface, for those that are more DevOps inclined, you can also do all this from the Akash CLI, which again is typically my choice, but it's much more common within the community to use the GUI tools that I'm going to show you. So I'll go down that path for our sake of our demonstration today. So if we go back to that documentation and we look at our tools available, I'm going to be using the Akash console. So if you're becoming familiar and experimenting with Akash deployments for the first time, you can just visit our documentation site and then click on Akash console or Cloud Most Deploy are probably your two best avenues to get started. And if you go into the Akash console, it'll show you and give you readily available information on how to access the console, how to create a wallet, so that you can get started with Akash deployments and different settings. So it should be very easy to get started with Akash deployments if you just use our documentation site. So taking a step back, I'm going to copy the SDL that we did somewhat of a cursory deep dive into earlier. I'm going to grab that SDL, and then I'm going to go on to the Akash console web app that we can use to create deployments, and I'm going to create a custom application. As you can see from the Akash console, we give users of the Akash network very easy ways to get started. So if you're doing something like deploying an Akash RPC node or an RPC node for another Cosmos chain, we have templates that make it very easy to get started. Or if you're trying to host as a tenant, you need to launch a React website or different type of web app. We have some templates that make it very easy to get started. And now with our recent introductions of GPUs on the Akash network, we also have many AI machine learning models as well. So again, with just the click of a mouse, you can choose a template and launch something like Stable Diffusion and different type of workloads onto the Akash network. But for the purpose of our experimentation and just to launch a test GPU workload on the Akash network, I'm going to take that SDL that I dove into earlier, and I'm going to put that in to an empty template. So I'm not using a pre-existing template. I'm just using my own SDL file, and I'm going to go ahead and save and close that. I'm just going to label the deployment that I'm creating as a GPU test, and then I'm going to move forward with creating a deployment. This goes through some initial sanity checks to make sure that we have proper funding in our Kepler wallet. Again, this is all explained within our deployment tools documentation, making sure that I have sufficient funds, making sure that the SDL that I'm using doesn't have any syntax errors, and that I have a valid certificate to communicate with the network. And then when I move forward with creating this deployment, and Kepler prompts a transaction fee acceptance window. So I'm just going to accept that transaction fee. And now what's happening at this point is we are launching that order that I previously talked about. We're launching an order onto the Akash blockchain. When I launch that order onto the Akash blockchain, different self-sovereign providers will respond back with a bid. So if we go back to our SDL, and you're a provider that's able to facilitate a NVIDIA T4 GPU chip, and you're able to facilitate the CPU memory and storage requirements and the price requirements for my deployment, you'll respond back with a bid. If we go back to the provider that I'm using kind of as a test bed, and we go back to the curl of the status endpoint of that provider that we looked at earlier, you can see that my provider's name is akashtesting.xyz. So if we go back to the Akash console, we can see that provider.akash.testing.xyz is one of the providers that has responded with a bid. So I'm going to select that provider. I want this workload to land specifically on my own self-sovereign provider. I want it to land on this Kubernetes cluster. And let's actually do this. I'm going to, just from a Kubernetes perspective, I'm going to show all the pods that are currently running. And the reason I'm doing this is once I launch this deployment, we're going to see that a new pod is going to launch onto my Kubernetes cluster, and that's the deployment that I'm currently launching. So I'm going to go ahead and select that provider and then move forward with the process, accept a couple of transaction fees. And now, as a tenant, role playing from the tenant perspective and a deployer onto the Akash network, my workload is now launching specifically onto that provider that I selected. So now if we go back to my own self-sovereign provider and we look at pods, we can see obtain GPU workload hit my provider, and that comes from we name the service within the SDL obtain GPU. So now if we go back to my provider and look at my Kubernetes cluster, we see that a new pod is launched and it's currently in a pending state while it's pulling down the container image and is launching that that container in full. So we can see that that has now hit my provider. So now at this point, I'm kind of done with the journey from a tenant perspective. And now I want to start focusing more on the GPU provider, which is the main topic of our conversation. So we can already see within the Akash provider that this obtained GPU-enabled workload has hit my provider. If I want to dive into this a little bit deeper, I'm going to look at, in Kubernetes, I'm going to look at the logs. And actually, let me back up one step. If I do kubectl and I look at the pods on my Kubernetes cluster and I look at the name service Akash services, which we looked at this a little bit earlier, we know that there's a pod running in this Kubernetes cluster called Akash provider -0. That's the actual brains and the provider services for an Akash provider running as a pod within my Kubernetes cluster. So if we know that that's the provider pod, and I want to deep dive into this and actually look at logs for the deployment that was just launched by this tenant, this deployer onto the Akash network, I can do a kubectl and I can look at logs, and I'm going to look at the logs for the Akash provider pod. So if I do that, I'm just going to leave that screen for 1 second and go back and look at this GPU test workload that I just launched. What I'm highlighting is what we refer to on the Akash network as a DSEC number, or and that's short for deployment ID, or actually deployment sequence, but you can think of it as a deployment ID. So the number that I'm currently highlighting is the DSEC, or the deployment ID, for the workload that I launched onto the Akash network. If I take that DSEC number and now I have these logs, and I'm just going to actually search for that DSEC. Let me try to minimize this participant screen. So if we do that, we can see that if I go through the history of the provider logs, I can see when I talked about an order being launched onto the network. So let me just make sure that this is clear. When I launched a deployment onto the Akash network and I talked about an order hitting the Akash blockchain, my provider, this provider test server and cluster that we're looking at, detected that order. So through an event bus, this provider is constantly monitoring the blockchain for new orders that are hitting the blockchain. And it obviously immediately detected that there's a new order. And this marries with the deployment ID that I showed you in the deployment tool. So we see that the provider recognized that an order hit the blockchain. And then this is our key step of bid complete. This shows evidence that my provider responded to that tenant. So again, if we're doing the role playing, we have a tenant that's launching the workload onto the network. And now we have this GPU provider that's responding with a bid. So it's responding with a certain price point that it's willing to host the workload. And in my deployment tool, I could see that I had the option of selecting amongst a few different providers. So I theoretically might have a provider that's offering this type of workload, the type of resources necessary for this workload for 25% of the cost of another provider. So again, this is an open ecosystem of these self-sovereign providers. We don't control the pricing at all. The pricing is completely controlled by the providers, and that's why we often on the Akash network see savings of like 80 to 90% over GCP or AWS or Azure, because we have this competitive landscape where we have these different GPU providers that are trying to win leases or trying to win workloads. And so that obviously that can drive down the price point. So based on what I dictated on the provider as my own pricing schematics, I've now responded with a bid. When we were looking at this from the tenant perspective, when I responded from a bid, that's when we would have seen in the deployment tool, the bid from my Akash testing.xyz server or provider show up. And that's when this bid is complete. That's when the bid was extended to the client. Because I decided to go with my own provider. I've talked about leases a couple of times, and we could see that at this point in our journey, my GPU provider has won this lease. So an order was launched on the network and a lease was created when I selected the provider. And that's when we go into a lease one state. So I'm just going through and just making sure that I touch all the points that I wanted to touch on. So a lot of this is the main things that I wanted to show on the Akash GPU provider. Again, going through the documentation, we can very easily build one of these GPU providers. And we've now kind of gone through a full role-playing exercise of the tenant and the provider and seen, based on the STL that the tenant has selected, the order being placed on the blockchain. We see the bid coming back from my own provider. And now if we went back and actually looked at the status endpoint for my provider, we can see that we now have a GPU that GPU is no longer available because I'm now utilizing that GPU in a live deployment. So it's kind of come full circle, and we can now see that deployment running on my own provider. Again, just checking my notes to make sure that I'm not forgetting anything. So obviously we could go back to the tenant perspective as well, and we can see the logs and the lease status for this. So we saw the lease status from the GPU provider perspective, and we can now also see the lease perspective from the deployer or the tenant. So this lease is now 100% running and active on the Akash network. I'm trying to think of, actually, let me take a pause while I think of if there's anything else that I want to show from a provider perspective. Any questions come in that we can address?
Can't see any for now. I think all is well.
Okay. How about from your own perspective, Rodri? I know that obviously we've helped plan this session together and kind of want to go through this role playing exercise of showing both the Akash SDLs and the tenant perspective, and also the makeup and the topology of a Akash provider. Anything as I'm trying to consider myself, if there's anything else that we want to show on the GPU provider perspective, anything else that you can think of that might be helpful to cover?
No, I think you covered everything pretty well. Thank you so much for explaining that. And like you said, we're always ready on our Discord to help out with any doubts or questions that may come up.
Sure. Yeah, so just since we have some available times, and I may think of some other things that maybe we want to look at from the provider perspective as well. But I showed earlier that we have this ability to go into our ecosystem partner Prater and look at the live providers on the network. Now that we're kind of familiar with my own provider, so again, if we go back and look at the status endpoint that I've been utilizing, my provider is Akash testing.xyz. So if I go to the Prater app and I put in Akash testing as partial name, why isn't that showing up? Well, we don't have to look at this. I was just going to show, we can just drill into, I'm not sure why my provider currently isn't showing up, but we could also look at another provider as well. This could also give you a lot of insight into becoming an Akash provider and some of the mechanics behind it. So looking at this provider on the network, we can see how many active deployments they have and the amount of leases that are part of those active deployments. And we can also drill into specifics behind the provider. So not, I showed you earlier, the network in general, the amount of GPUs and CPUs, memory and storage that are on the network in total. And we can also drill into individual providers as well. So for this individual provider, we can see they're not currently hosting any GPU resources, but we can look at the amount of CPU, amount of persistent storage they have. And we can also, when you go through your provider build process, you'll advertise a number of attributes for your provider. So attributes from a Akash provider perspective might be a region is probably an illuminating example. So as you can see, this provider is located in Europe. So if we have, like network latency concerns, or possibly we have, some mandates by our home country of if I'm hosting this web app or this deployment or AI model on one of our GPUs, that it needs to be in country. So a provider will advertise these different attributes. And then when I'm launching my workload in this SDL, I can include attributes that I want to. So this would actually be like an attributes field within the SDL. And I can specify that as an attribute, I need region to be, US West. And then from a tenant perspective, I can dictate attributes that must be met by the provider. And then obviously from a provider perspective, on the inverse, I can advertise and try to gain workloads by the attributes that I'm advertising. So these attributes, if I was to put in to my SDL the attribute of region US West, when I place that order onto the Akash blockchain, my provider would not be allowed to bid unless it was advertising an attribute of region US West. So this is a control mechanism to ensure that only providers that are able to facilitate the attributes that are necessary for my deployment are met. And we go through some different auditing procedures as well. So to safeguard against, if I'm a provider and I just want to say that I'm in US West, but I'm not necessarily in that region and is somewhat fictitious, we go through auditing processes where our own team will go through and audit these attributes so that our tenants have the safeguards and assurance that the attributes that these providers are advertising are legitimate. So that's the way that as a provider, I can try to garner more interest and more activity and more lease activity specifically on my provider. And then also from a tenant perspective, I can ensure that I'm landing on an appropriate provider based on attributes that my workload needs to meet. So I think with that, I know that is a lot. Really, to become, obviously the thing that we want to highlight today is that with new recent Net 6 release, we're now supporting GPU providers on the Akash network. So I wanted to go through a demonstration of, again, we could go back to our documentation and we could have a full. Looks like I closed the doc site. Let me just get back to it. We could definitely have a full. Oh, it's right here. We could definitely have a full session, but it would probably be like a 2 or 3 hour session where we could go through the actual build mechanisms of building an Akash provider. But we've got the feedback recently. Actually, I just got this feedback from Rodri yesterday that our documentation, I think, is at the point that most are able to get through the provider build process without issue. So I think in order to actually gain the most out of that experience, if you have available GPU resources, or you're not becoming a GPU provider and just becoming a non-GPU Akash provider, if you go through our documentation, I think it'll be very illuminating. As you can see, and maybe I'll just touch on this for a couple minutes. If we were to kind of step through the process and procedures of building an Akash provider, the first thing that we do, obviously, since these are providers are running Kubernetes clusters in the back end, we have full guidance on how to build an appropriate Kubernetes cluster for your Akash provider. So that's where we'll begin in the provider build process. And then without actually digging into these steps, but kind of just looking at them as we progress, we first build out that Kubernetes cluster, which is going to be the brains in our backend for our GPU provider in this circumstance. We then go through providing guidance on how you can install necessary NVIDIA drivers and toolkits on the Kubernetes hosts that have GPU resources. Then go through running the NVIDIA runtime, which is a mechanism in a Kubernetes cluster. We need to run a NVIDIA runtime in that Kubernetes cluster. Then we proceed. Earlier, we were preparing our host for our Kubernetes cluster. And now in our next step, we're actually going through and actually creating the Kubernetes cluster. So again, if we go back and look at my live example, we'll bring you step by step through how to get to this stage. So if I, again, look at the topology of my Kubernetes cluster and this single control plane and 2 worker nodes, we'll bring you through the entire steps on how to ready your host to build that Kubernetes cluster. Then we'll actually go through the process using our default documentation, installs Kubernetes using kubespray and Ansible in the back end. We'll walk you through all this in very explicit instructions how to do that. We'll then look at the health of the Kubernetes cluster. And then via Helm, for those that are familiar with Helm and Kubernetes administrators, we'll go through the deployment of your Akash provider using a Helm-based installation. And then we'll walk you through testing some deployments. So some very similar activity to what I went through today. We'll do a sanity check that your GPU, test workloads or even non-GPU workloads, go through a migrative testing to make sure that the cluster looks healthy. And then go through some other things like domain name reviews. So domain name reviews, like when I was looking at as Zoom windows in the way currently, but when I was doing a curl of my status endpoint and I was using Akash testing.xyz, we'll walk you through the necessary domain names that you need for an Akash provider, and then go through some additional GPU testing as well. And then the very last thing that I'll leave you with, again, if I arm you with the proper documentation, you'll obviously be able to go a far way, especially with our assistants in the Discord room and Discord channels. The other thing that I would bring your attention to is when we go through these provider builds, we have some excellent documentation on a provider checkup. So once you have your provider up and running, we'll bring you through a myriad of steps to make sure that test deployments are hitting your provider. When I showed you looking for the order and the bid complete in the provider logs, we'll go through steps of validating that that's working properly by looking at some provider logs and just make sure that your provider is finely tuned and ready for production use. And then after your provider is up and running, along with the support that you get in the Discord channel, we also have some excellent documentation for provider maintenance and troubleshooting. So like if you need to bring down your provider to do server maintenance or, like upgrade drivers or things of that activity, how to properly scale down your provider, perform maintenance, and then bring back up your provider without interrupting any of the workloads that are on the provider. Again, how to look at some provider logs. And then we'll also get into some information in this maintenance FAQ and troubleshooting documentation for things like looking at your profitability of your Akash provider. So say you have a GPU provider up and running, it's now been a week, you want to make sure that you're getting an adequate number of leases and that those leases are extracting the proper, and I actually went into the wrong document. I meant to go into provider earnings. Not only that those leases look healthy, but we'll also get into some profit analysis. So total AKT, obviously Akash's cryptocurrency that provides security and for the network, and also the default denomination that we use for providers and deployments. We can get in and look at the total AKT earned by the provider over time and get into some very granular information as well about earnings, potential earnings per deployment, and also look at like current leases. And we can look at things like these workloads have been running for several weeks or several months, and we can look at how much AKT has been withdrawn from the lease for those, and just do a sanity check to make sure that we're, as a provider, generating the amount of revenue and extracting that revenue from the leases as we would expect. So a lot of good sanity checks in this maintenance FAQ and troubleshooting document as well. So I know that's a lot, and I think we're pretty close to time. I'm actually seeing that I have some stuff in the chat here. Were there any questions at this point? I'm just going to look at the chat.
We do have 2 questions here in the chat.
Okay.
Oh yeah, we do have 2 questions. So So with the vanilla K8s cluster, what's the high level gist to get my provider installed? I want to avoid anything that uses lightweight K8s such as Praetor, but I have failed to follow the Helm steps before. This is the first question we've got.
Yeah, and I'm looking at that question at the same time. So with a vanilla K8s cluster, what's the high level gist to get my provider installed? So the high level gist, and again, if there's any ambiguity or roadblocks or stumbling blocks as you go through this process, we're always here to support. But essentially, to the question of the high level gist of what it takes to run a Akash provider, it would be starting at this documentation, and we'll be going through our instructions for how to build your Kubernetes cluster. That will be the brains for your Akash provider. And then we'll go through the process of deploying the provider as a Kubernetes pod onto that Kubernetes cluster with these instructions. And then we'll go through a full, so obviously there's a lot involved in that. I'm speaking at this at a very high level, but from the highest level, essentially the steps that are involved is following our documentation to create a Kubernetes cluster using Kubespray and Ansible. And then once you have a healthy Kubernetes cluster, then installing a Akash provider as a pod onto that Kubernetes cluster using Helm charts. And again, if you have any trouble at all, please reach out to us in Discord.
Okay, so we have another question which says, what about stable payments? Can we deploy and have a provider get paid with USDC now?
Yeah, so this is actually so we did the mainnet 6 upgrade of the network. And then after the mainnet 6 upgrade was complete, we had a governance proposal to support Axelar USDC. That governance proposal passed. So as of, I believe, last Thursday, we now accept stable payments in the form of Axelar USDC for now. So we can, the community can launch additional governance proposals to add other stable payments mechanisms, but today the supported stable payment is Axelar USDC. So we have documentation now. If you get into, and I actually know this well because I actually just recently added this, but if you go into the SDL documentation that I referenced earlier and you go into stable payments, you can see how as a tenant you would be able to pay via USDC stable payments. And there's also now instructions. We have a bid script for providers. Let me see if I can get to this real quick. So if I go to the Akash GitHub organization and then go into the Helm chart repository, and look at charts and look at the Akash provider directory. And then under scripts, we have a price script. So this is just a bash shell script. And this is when you're going through your provider build process, we have a default bid script. And this is also where you can go in and customize your own settings. So for instance, if I have a GPU and I wanted my target price per month to realize for that single GPU would be $50 a month, I can go in and edit this bid script, or for CPUs or memory or anything else. This is how I control my pricing that I want to extend for bids on the Akash network. And now because we have just recently introduced Axelar USDC stable payments, this script is a mechanism where a provider can determine if they want to support stable payments or not. That's completely up to the provider. They can support stable payments or they can only accept AKT. And in this bid script is the mechanism that you would, as a provider, determine if you want to support stable payments. But the short answer to your question is yes, we definitely do now. As of, I think it was last Thursday again, do now support stable payments in Axelar USDC. And those are the mechanisms that you would launch a deployment with USDC from a deployment perspective. This is also how you would control and support that from a provider perspective as well. Okay, so those are, and it's pretty good timing. I think we got through it. Those are the questions that I see for now, and I think we're right at time. So it seemed like it was time pretty perfectly. Anything else as we're Rodri or anyone else? Anything that we want to finish with?
I think all is good for now. Rodrigo, if you have anything else that you want to touch some light on, feel free to do that now.
No, all good. Thank you.
Perfect then. If you have any other questions, feel free to hop on in the Akash Discord. The documentation is also provided on the hackathon page on DoraHacks. And yeah, guys, 9 or 10 days more to go until the submissions close. We've already received great bunch of submissions. Excited to see what the next 10 days have. And all the best. Feel free to just hop on if you have any questions regarding the documentation, server, etc. And yeah, with that being said, all the best to everyone who's building in this season of Akash-a-thon, $50,000 up for grab in Akash token. Thanks
Yeah,
a
I
lot.
appreciate your time. Yeah, I appreciate the time, everyone. And yeah, look forward to chatting with you in Discord as you're building out your GPU providers.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.